grew up poor in the midst of the dysfunctional culture of Appalachia. I believe we hillbillies are the toughest goddamn people on this earth, he writes in his new memoir, but we hillbillies must wake the hell up. Today on Uncommon Knowledge, J.D. Vance and his Hillbilly Elegy.
This is Mongolian Mindset, and today we're going to be typing J.D. Vance to keep the political movement going. We'll be using Linda Barrens Interaction Styles and Temperament combined with cognitive functions. We have a breakdown of that. Playlist, just go to How to Find Anyone's Personality Type. We also have the cognitive functions broken down as well. Just go to cognitive function playlist. But let's go see what the monkeys at Personality Database has J.D. Vance as. J.D. Vance, they have him as an ESTJ. Okay, politicians, we know, generally speaking, usually they are ESTJs. So let's go check the chart. So ESTJs, they're direct, they're outcome, they're systematic, they're concrete. They're TEFI, they're SINE. They're initiating, okay. How do you say outcome? An affiliative, okay. If he meets those metrics, we'll call him an ESTJ. If he doesn't, we'll find his actual personality type. I know we had somebody in the group say that they think he could be an ENTJ. So we're going to put that to test today. We got our metrics over here. And as we go, we'll be knocking them down, okay. So be great. And comment below what you think his type is. And guys, we are still doing the free typing sessions by us. To get into that, all you have to do is 1, subscribe to the channel, 2, join the Discord, and 3, go to the channel, request a typing service. Then you'll be sent to Calendly, and then you'll be able to sign up. I do think we are the best at finding people's personality type right now, and the Discord is really picking up. I think that's really going to be something special. You're going to want to say you were a part of that. So go ahead and join our Discord as well. The Facebook group is also open. You can join that as well if you don't have Discord. Let's get into it.
Uncommon Knowledge now.
Yeah, that's right. So when he came home drunk, he passed out on the couch. And my grandma was not one for sort of taking things lying down. So she decided she was going to honor her word. And she poured gasoline on him, as I write in the book, and lit a match to him. And he sort of, a part of him caught on fire.
So grandma sounds like she's pragmatic.
And it was my aunt, who at the time was 11 or 12 years old, who sort of leapt into action and saved him from potentially burning to death. It's funny, or maybe just morbid, but I think a little bit of both, that when I was talking about this story with family later, someone said, JD, I think maybe you didn't get that story quite right. And I think, oh no, what detail have I messed up that I put in the book? And they said, I think that it was lighter fluid, not gasoline. And so there's some debate about what the actual substance was, but I think it goes to show, one, that the house that my grandparents built after they moved from Appalachia to Southern Ohio was pretty chaotic. And second, that they were pretty extraordinary people in their own way.
Okay, so that's your family. We'll come back to your family. Let's talk about the people a little bit more generally. From Hillbilly Elegy, I do not identify with the WASPs of the Northeast.
Sure.
Instead, I identify with the millions of working class white Americans of Scots-Irish descent. Okay, quick history lesson, make it this big. Who are the Scots-Irish? When did they come to this country? What makes them distinctive?
Yeah, so Scots-Irish is a bit of a misnomer because it's the Scots, the Irish, but also people who tended to come from the northern parts of England so basically rural people who came from the broad UK. They tended to settle in the United States in the 17th and 18th centuries, and they tended to cluster along the Appalachian Mountains, so Western Virginia, what we now know as West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Southern Ohio. I don't have a fantastic argument for why they clustered in those regions. I mean, some people have argued that they were drawn to the mountains of Appalachia in the same way that they were drawn, to
some people would argue that's a TE statement,
or the mountains back in the Highland. But they were a very distinctive subculture. And what's relatively, interesting, if you look at the ethnography of these areas, they still are very heavily overrepresented in these parts of the country. So even though there's been a lot of assimilation, a lot of dispersion, there's still a disproportionate share of the Scots-Irish in Appalachia.
And the important point is that these people who now live in Appalachia and have spread out, as you said, again, we'll come to your story about moving from Kentucky to Ohio. They come to this country in the 18th, late 17th, early mid 18th century, when the borderlands of England and Scotland and when Ireland are still very rough, violent places.
Correct.
And they bring with them they take a certain level of violence for granted. It's part of their lives. And they also, family plays in those regions as opposed to southern England, which is much more settled and becomes wealthier and more, frankly, I suppose the term would be more civilized much earlier. In those regions, much more is based on clan. Family has a different weight among these people. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, whatever the cause is, there is a lot of evidence that suggests that the Scots-Irish valued honor and family loyalty in a very, very personal and deep way. And because of it, they weren't totally afraid.
There's a lot of evidence, okay? So I'm going to say that's TE, that's outside information, outside sources there. That supports his conclusion there, so that's TE.
To enforce that family honor code in a way that sometimes led to violence. And so you look at these areas, they tend to be much more violent than similarly situated demographic areas. And
to this very day.
To this very day.
So basically, from what I've read a long time ago about this area, it almost plays like the hood areas with like in the ghettos and shit, where they like shoot up and kill each other. It's like the same shit. They have a respect culture. You fuck up, respect is everything to them. It's like the same thing in like hood ghetto people.
Okay. And again, the cause is something that's interesting that I don't have a great insight on, but it's just there. Whether they brought it from the old country, whether it's something they developed after they landed, but there's definitely a very clear sense in which, one, the extended kinship of family is very, very important to these people, but also that they suffer disproportionate rates of violence, not just violence against others, but also violence inside the home, which is something I obviously write about.
And one more characteristic of the Scots-Irish, of your people, so to speak, as a whole, before we move on. You mentioned tended to settle in Appalachia, you name the states, West Virginia, Kentucky, and so forth. They've spread out, but tend to spread out to the upper South and the Midwest. And the point I'd like to stress about that is, implicit in your book, they're a long way from the media centers of the East Coast and the West Coast. So we are talking about a distinctive culture of people who've been here for a couple of centuries that the rest of the country, the media culture in the rest of the country, tends to overlook. Is that fair?
I definitely think that's fair. The one caveat I would say is that though there is definitely a regional distinction and a sort of cloistering of the Scots-Irish in a part of the country that is very cut.
All right, he's direct. Okay, he's direct. Let's go ahead and knock direct off the board. He's specific, concise, to the point there. I mean, he's direct. And he's a TE user, so you're looking at an STJ or an NTJ, and I'm thinking this guy's an ESTJ.
Off from the media centers of the country. I do think it's fair to say that Scots-Irish culture has been very, very influential on what we call American culture more broadly. There's a really interesting book by a guy named Jeff Brigger's United States of Appalachia.
Drop in a book, that's an outside source, that's empirical data, that's TE.
Which really chronicles the ways in which Appalachian culture is very, very influential on mainstream American culture. And, I think that's still true today. So there's still a sense in which what a lot of the things that we think of as American are at least somewhat related and influenced by Scots-Irish culture. Obviously, a lot of other cultures too, but I do think Scots-Irish culture plays a pretty big part.
Okay. They break through at the national level with Andrew Jackson.
That's right.
He's a Scots-Irish president.
That's right.
And we'll come back to politics in a moment. First, your family. The move from Jackson, Kentucky, which is Appalachia proper, to Middleton, Ohio. Why?
Well, for very, very stark economic reasons. So this is the 1940s. This is before especially generous social welfare programs. And I think at a very stark level, if my grandparents hadn't moved from Jackson, Kentucky, they faced a choice, right? Poverty, potentially starvation, maybe scraping by a relatively successful life. But if they moved to the industrial powerhouses that were developing in the Rust Belt, what we now call the Rust Belt, but back then was the land of opportunity.
Right.
They had an opportunity at the steel mill or at the paper mill to earn a decent middle class livable wage. And so that's what brought not just them, but millions of others into those Midwestern factories.
Okay, so, and yet you describe, you're observing, you state that in hillbillyology, that when they moved to middle-class Ohio, they did not behave like middle-class Ohioans. They did not become suburban.
Yeah, that's right. It took a while to really adapt to the cultural norms of Midwestern middle-class life. And one of the takeaways from the book is that culture is really sticky in a certain way, right? You don't just all of a sudden acquire material comfort and then all of the habits, all of the attitudes that you grew up with, you completely cast off. That's something my grandparents learned when they were integrating into 1950s nuclear family middle-class life in Ohio. It's something I, of course, learned as an adult myself, that culture is sort of sticky, so they did struggle to adjust in a certain way.
All right. So here you are growing up in Middleton, Ohio. Your mother, this is painful to read, painful to discuss. You said you counted 15 stepdads, quotation marks around the stepdads, husbands, boyfriends, and so forth, moved through her life and your life when you were still a child.
Sure.
And let me quote from hillbillyology. Our homes are a chaotic mess. We scream and yell at each other.
Talking about chaos, that'd be an outcome control type thing.
At least one member of the family uses drugs. We don't study as children, and we don't make our kids study when we're parents. And that was your way of life until you were 13 or 14 years old or so.
More or less, yeah.
More or less.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So one
And
of
it
the
struck you as
interesting-
normal.
It definitely struck me as normal. And in fact, I would say the alternative struck me as abnormal, right? So when, my aunt, the same one who put the fire out on my grandfather, when she married my Uncle Dan, I remember, and I love these people very much, we're all very close. I remember thinking that his extended family was odd because they were so nice to each other. They didn't bicker and fight at Christmas and Thanksgiving. They didn't talk bad about each other behind their backs. And because of that, I thought that they were a little bit weird. So that there definitely was a sense in which the family environment that I grew up around, which was very foreign and very chaotic to, sort of upper class American mindset, was very normal to me.
All right, let's stick with your life story for a moment longer. When you were about 15, you stopped moving from home to home to home with your mother and moved in with your grandmother, Mamaw.
Sure.
This same woman
God, I don't know what he looks like, but he reminds me of somebody.
doused your grandfather with lighter fluid and tossed a match on him.
Sure.
Once again from hillbillyology, those 3 years with Mamaw, uninterrupted and alone, saved me. She was uneducated, she swore like a sailor, and she could be dangerous. How did she save you?
Well, the part of my grandma that would, potentially set somebody on fire if they crossed her, it had a good side too, right? Or at least a partially good side. So, I was like a lot of kids who grew up in this environment. I was very close to, I was not doing especially well at school. I was starting to experiment with drugs and alcohol. I was starting to hang out with the proverbial wrong crowd. And I remember when I was a kid, not quite 15, probably 12 or 13. And my grandma, even though I wasn't living with her 100% of the time, I still spent a lot of time with her. She still had a big influence in my life. I remember I started hanging out with this kid who was sort of known to be a local druggie. And my grandma found out, and she leaned in and said, JD, I want to tell you something. If you don't stop hanging out with that kid, I'm going to run him over with my car, and no one is ever going to find out. Now, do I think that Mamaw, in hindsight, would have actually ran over a 13-year-old kid? Absolutely not. But she was,
as a reader of your book, I'm not so sure.
But Mamaw was always very protective of kids, and I think in her own way she probably felt very bad for him. But what she did believe, and what I believed, is that she would enforce that rule. She knew that I thought she would enforce that rule. And so when she made that promise, unlike a lot of kids who grew up in that circumstance who would say, screw it, I'm going to hang out with the bad kid in secret, or maybe just ignore what my parents say, I believed her, and so I completely cut off contact with that kid. There were a lot of little things like that where my grandma provided some, whether it was discipline or whether it was stability in the home. That
Standards
just gave
also
me,
reading.
Of course.
She expected you to do your homework, to behave, and if you didn't, she was going to come after you.
No, that's absolutely right. She was very hard on me in a way that I needed. She demanded that I get a job, that I work hard in the job, that I pay my own way. She demanded that I go to school and that I get good grades. She had, by the time that I lived with Mamaw, that was probably the poorest I ever was growing up. We had very, very little money. I remember that she went and bought a TI-89 graphing calculator because I was in the advanced math class at school.
That was the hot calculator.
That was the hot calculator at that stage, and exactly. And Mamaw said, "Look, you lazy bastard, if I can pay for this calculator with as little money as I have, then you are going to work hard in school. You're going to do well." And that meant something to me. That really meant a lot. And so I did in a lot of different ways.
That's that fire there. Eternal harmony meant something to me.
She had this influence on me that really set me on the right path.
Again, we'll continue with your story here. I want to get back to your people, so to speak, but your story, because here you sit, beautifully articulate, wonderfully well-groomed, high-flying young man at a
To tell my wife
capital
that.
management. I'll put it in writing. I'll put it in writing. So, briefly, how you got from there to here, so to speak. After high school, United States Marine Corps,
Right.
which meant what to you?
Well, it meant that it was an organization to me that had really high standards and that had a certain place in American history.
Organization, standards, affiliative.
In my generation of grandkids, there were 6 of us. 3 of us joined the Marine Corps. 2 of my older cousins, and both of them encouraged me to join the Marines, especially my cousin Rachel, who I'm very close to. So it was a big part of just getting out and seeing the world, learning certain standards, and also being exposed
Learning
to certain...
standards, that's procedures, that's standards, that's systematic. That's also TE, so we can close out TE now. We know this guy. We know that, okay? And if he's direct, NTFI is automatically systematic, okay? All right, he's automatic systematic, okay? This other guy's annoying the shit out of me because he won't let him talk, but...
values that the Marine Corps had, certain educational traits that I didn't acquire when I was a kid. The Marine Corps really instilled those things and gave me a lot of opportunities because of it.
And then Ohio State, and then Yale Law School. In Hillbilly Elegy, you write, well, I won't quote you. I'll let you do. Since I have you right here, just tell what it was like to hear your classmates talk about the armed forces of the United States when you had just served in the Marines.
Well, I should say that most of my classmates were, very good people, and if they were, if they were unfamiliar with the
Saying the right thing, affiliative. Come on.
military, which a lot of them were, they at least thought it was a curiosity.
I should say.
Not a negative curiosity. They were just, they wanted to know what was it like. They didn't know many people who had served before. So there was definitely an element of that. Some people were a little bit more hostile to military service and to those in the military. I think that came from not really knowing anyone who served. So
Boy, are you cutting them a lot of slack?
Well, I'm the reason I'm cutting them a lot of slack is because most of them really were good people, and I don't want to give the wrong impression that I had a couple of bad experiences, and this is something.
Bad experiences, SI. He's affiliative, man.
Something that a lot of people, not to get too political, but a lot of people on the left, I think, will take a couple of bad apples and say, well, the whole group is bad. And so I want to resist that. But definitely there were some people who were very
Here's the feeling I get. Correct me if I'm wrong. The feeling I get is that when you move from Middleton, Ohio, into the United States Marine Corps, you are not moving from one world into a completely foreign world. The United States Marine Corps had enough continuity with the best of the tradition in which you grew up. These people are patriotic, they understand the importance of hard work. What the Marine Corps gave you was standards.
Right.
It forced you to perform, but it didn't seem, as I read Hillbilly Elegy, a really foreign world to you.
That's right.
When you moved to Yale, you were on another planet. Is that fair, or am I overstating it?
Oh, that's absolutely fair. I mean, you have to think demographically, the Marine Corps was not all that dissimilar. Marine Corps is very racially diverse, but in terms of
Demographically, TE, data.
experiences, in terms of income classes, it's primarily middle income, working class kids. It's not kids who are especially poor or especially wealthy. So there was a sense in which the experiences of the kids in the Marine Corps was very similar to my own. That wasn't true at Yale Law School.
Okay, all right. Immigrants to new countries, I knew this, there were some immigrants when I was growing up who were all kinds of
And if
wistful.
you see this guy, he's not going through any progressions whatsoever, man. He's not. He's fucking outcome. He's the ESTJ.
Talk about Italy in the old days, but also almost a certain sense of guilt. They'd left people behind.
Sure.
Do you feel any kind of strange sense of dislocation having, you are not a hillbilly anymore, JD. Or if you are a hillbilly, you are the best. You make Jed Clampett look like a piker, and you're doing beautifully. Yale Law School, San Francisco. Do you feel any strange sense of dislocation that you've left good people behind?
Well, let me say first, I do think I'm a hillbilly, and I think that if you think that I'm so different from hillbillies, then my sense is that you ought to give them just a little bit more credit, if I may say that.
Sure.
So a lot of
or
the
you
folks,
less.
maybe, or me less. Yeah, that's right. So a lot of the folks that I grew up with, I think, would defy the stereotype in a lot of different ways, and hopefully I sort of give credit to my people, though I'm sure, like you said, I maybe make them look a little bad in some ways. But my sense of whether I have a certain sense of survival's guilt or a certain remorse for having left, the answer is absolutely yes.
Really?
I definitely feel, maybe it's just because of the way that I am, or maybe it's because of the familial culture that I grew up in, I definitely feel that I owe people back home a lot more than I'm currently giving. And I don't know, there are a number of different ways to get involved, and I've thought since the publication of the book, what is the best way for me to really give back? But I definitely
the best way there, the systematic.
Have this sense that I owe something to the folks back home. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's good to be attached to a community and to feel like you should be doing a little bit more.
I think it's good to be attached to a community. I feel a diff.
Or maybe, it comes along with some feeling of survivor's guilt, but I don't think that's a especially heavy burden to bear.
Okay. I look forward to the J.D. Vance scholarship for hillbillies at Yale. So back to the people you left behind now. Alone among all American ethnic and demographic groups, working class whites in recent years have seen their lifespans get shorter.
Sure.
This is the most fundamental measure of well-being. Every other kind of American is living longer, and your people are dying sooner.
Sure.
They're also the most pessimistic people in America. I'm quoting hillbillyology. Well over half of blacks, Latinos, and college-educated whites expect that their children will fare better economically than they have. Among working class whites, only 44% share that expectation.
TE.
Now, you provide a very disheartening survey. You go aspect by aspect of life among your people. And I just like to go down, in a certain sense, your list and have you explain how this came to be. Family violence and breakdown. Quote, we didn't live a peaceful life in a small nuclear family. We lived a chaotic life in big groups of aunts, uncles, grandparents, and cousins, close quote. How come? Is that something where you can draw a straight line all the way back to the Scots Highlands? Or is this something that's developed since, say, the Second World War? Because things have gotten worse. That's what we know. Things in one way or another have gotten worse in recent decades.
Sure. So my sense is that connection to the extended network of kin has always been there. That's something that maybe traces back to the Highlands. But that a lot of the trends since the 1940s and 50s have taken that cultural impulse to the extended kin network and sort of warped it and produced a lot of bad consequences. So one, the geographic
consequences. Like I said, this guy has no
dislocation
progression.
caused by a lot of people moving north. It sort of forced my parents out of that extended network and required them to live in a nuclear family, which is not, it's something they took at least a while to adjust to. The economic pressures that have been caused, or that have been caused by factory closures and the decline of the Rust Belt economy and so forth.
I know somebody who looks like this motherfucker. I just can't put it together in my head. I don't know who it is. God damn.
I think that further buttressed these new nuclear families for people who weren't necessarily primed or trained to live in a nuclear family in the first place. And so I think that combination of the economic pressure placed on these families and the fact that for the first time in many generations they found themselves outside the extended network of kin created a lot of family pressures that produced some of the things I write about in the book.
The collapse of religious practice. Quote, in the middle of the Bible Belt.
Yeah, I'm done here. He's ESTJ. I'm done. All right. So he's outcome. You didn't see any progression in this guy at all. He's not journey focused. He's just outcome. Systematic, direct, TFI. He's affiliative. He's talking about the collective, the group, the community, belonging, interdependence. He's not talking about, being pragmatic. So yes, initiating and very fucking concrete. Jesus Christ. SINE. So JD Vance is an ESTJ, just like Kamala Harris, just like Obama, just like Joe Biden. Like, Jesus Christ, it's a breeding ground for the motherfuckers. ESTJ, he's above average. I could say prodigy, above average, whatever the fuck you want to call it. He's normalizing. I mean, the guy went from fucking nowhere to fucking Yale, so I'll give him that. Shit just don't happen for no reason. Normalizing. Okay. Enneagram here. I'm gonna hit him with 1 W2. I'm gonna go SO/SP. Okay. So we got him ESTJ above average, 1W2 SO/SP. Normalizing. That's what I'm going for. JD Vance. Yeah, damn, another politician down, another fucking ESTJ found. This is Mongolian Mindset, and we're out.